Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. My name is Christian Freeman. I'm a software developer and developer advocate. And today I'm really excited to come back for part 2 of our freeCodeCamp code through. So in the past video, we went through the responsive web design course, in particular the basic HTML and HTML5, and we did all 28 lessons of that section. And now in this one, we're going to be going through the basic CSS. There are 44 of those courses or lessons or challenges, however you want to refer to them. And in this video, we're going to go through every single one of them and show you how it works, what the answer is for each of them, and why that is the answer. We're going to explain what's going on for each of them, and we're going to code through it together. So if you are interested in more practice questions, deep dive into key concepts, and basically study guides for all of the stuff that we cover in these freeCodeCamp code throughs, go to the resources section on our website. I'll link to that in the description. It's just bitesize.xyz/resources. So if you sign up and become a member of our newsletter, you'll also get access to all of these study guides, all kinds of other stuff as well. Definitely recommend checking it out, and also check out our newsletter where I cover weekly topics in programming and helping you understand important concepts in software development. Okay, so with that, let's hop into the code and let's take a look at basic CSS. Change the color of text. Now let's change the color of some of our text. We can do this by changing the style of your H2 element. The property that is responsible for the color of an element's text is the color style property. Here's how you'd set your H2 element's text color to blue. So we have H2 and we have the style attribute here, and then we set that to a value of color : blue with a semicolon here at the end. It says, note that it is a good practice to end inline style declarations with a semicolon. So change your H2 element's style so that its text color is red. Okay, so let's find our H2, which is up here. And what we're going to do is we're going to give it a style attribute. And that's going to be equal to this string, which is in double quotes here. Okay, well, what is that going to be? It's going to be color : red, right? So with styles here, what we do is we set basically what's called a key and a value. So our key here is color. We're saying set color here : to some value, right? The value here is going to be red, and then we'll end that with a semicolon. You can see that the H2 here has turned red. Run the tests, and we get a pass. Use CSS selectors to style elements. So with CSS, there are hundreds of CSS properties that you can use to change the way an element looks on your page. When you entered H2 style color set to red, you were styling that individual H2 element with Inline CSS, which stands for cascading style sheets. That's one way to specify the style of an element, but there's a better way to apply CSS. At the top of your code, create a style block like this. So we have an opening style tag and then a closing style tag. Inside that style block, you can create a CSS selector for all H2 elements. For example, if you wanted all H2 elements to be red, you would add a style rule that looks like this. So now we have an open style tag, and then inside of that, we have the CSS selector, which says H2, and then a curly bracket. And then inside of that, color set to red, right? That's the same CSS style that we wrote in the past lesson. Close curly bracket, close style tag. Note that it's important to have both opening and closing curly braces, I guess curly brace, not curly bracket, around each element's style rule. You also need to make sure the element style definition is between the opening and closing style tags. Finally, be sure to add a semicolon to the end of each of your element's style rules. That's this line right here. Delete your H2 element's style attribute and instead create a CSS style block. Add the necessary CSS to turn all H2 elements blue. Okay, so let's start by removing this style attribute here. Basically what's happening in this lesson is we're going to be using actual CSS, writing CSS as part of a style block, which is a specific HTML tag that says inside of this is going to be CSS. So we're going to write it in an actual CSS format instead of using the HTML style attribute. So this is a more kind of global or a more sort of reusable way to write CSS that can target the entire, your entire HTML as opposed to tag by tag, H2 by H2. So let's make a style tag here, and then let's close that style tag as well. I'll just re-indent that. And now inside of that, is where I'm going to put my CSS, right? So I'll say, CSS goes here. Okay, so what do we do here? Well, we're going to say H2. We're going to target the H2 tag in CSS, and then we're going to do a curly brace, and you can see it automatically puts the closing one here as well. Now inside of that is where we put our actual CSS style. So we want to set our color here to blue. So we're going to say color blue, and then we're going to end that with a semicolon. So that's going to be the end of this line. And you can see that now turned it blue. So again, the style tag here is a specific way for us to use CSS inside of our HTML page. And in this case, we say H2. So we say, look for all of the H2 elements in this HTML and set color to blue. Run the tests and we get another pass. Use a CSS class to style an element. Classes are reusable styles that can be added to HTML elements. Here's an example CSS class declaration. So we have an open style tag, and then inside of that we have period blue dash text, and then inside of that we set color to blue. So the class here is this, right? So period blue dash text or dot blue dash text. So a class starts with a period or starts with a dot, and then we give it a class name, which is blue text. So you can see we created a CSS class called blue text within the style tag. You can apply a class to an element like this, h2 class equals blue text. Note that in your CSS style element, class names start with a period, and in your HTML elements class attribute, the class name does not include the period. Okay, so we say blue text here, dot blue text is the name of our class. And then when we use that class in our HTML, we say h2 class equals blue text without the period. So the period here says, hey, this is a CSS class. When we use that down here in our HTML, we do not include the period, very importantly. Inside your style element, change the H2 selector to red text and update the color's value from blue to red, and then give your H2 element the class attribute with a value of red text. Okay, so let's start by changing our H2. So right here, we're targeting all H2s, right? And now what we're gonna do instead is change that to a class called red text. And so you can see we say period red dash text, and then we change the color value from blue to red. Now we need to use that. How do we do that? Well, we come down to our H2 here and we give it a class attribute, which we give a value of red text. We don't do period red text here. Instead, we just say red dash text. You can see that that turned red here. So let's run the tests and we get another pass. Style multiple elements with a CSS class. So classes allow you to use the same CSS styles on multiple HTML elements. You can see this by applying your red text class to the first P element. Okay, so this is a short one, and the relevance here is that you can take a CSS class and you can reuse it multiple places. Okay, so right now we have H2 class equals red text. Okay, you can use that class on an H2, and you can also use it on any other number of elements. So if I come down to my paragraph tag here, if I say class equals red text, you can see that this turns red as well, right? So not only am I using this red text class on my H2, I'm also able to use it on as many other elements as I want, as long as I set class equals to red text. This is a reusable CSS class that can be applied to multiple places on the screen. So let's run the tests and we get another pass. Change the font size of an element. Font size is controlled by the font size CSS property like this. So H1, and then we give it this CSS style here of font dash size set to 30 px, which is pixels. So font size 30 px, 30 pixels. Inside the same style tag that contains your red text class, create an entry for p elements and set the font size to 16 pixels or 16 px. So we're going to make a second entry or a second sort of selector here in our style tag. And to do that, we're going to make a new line underneath where this closes, right? So this is one selector here and it ends right here. We're going to make another line, and I'll actually put a little blank line here for kind of readability. And I'm going to make another CSS selector here that targets paragraph tags or the P tag. And then I'm going to say font size. That's our key here, right? Font size is set to 16 px or 16 pixels. Okay, let's run the tests, and we get another pass. Set the font family of an element. You can set which font an element should use by using the font family property. For example, if you wanted to set your H2 element's font to sans serif, you would use the following CSS, H2 font family sans dash serif. So make sure all of your P elements use the monospace font. Okay, so we're targeting our P elements. We want to use the monospace font. So we have our P tag here already. So how do we add our font family? So take a second and think about how you might do that before I show you the answer. So what we want to do here is we don't want to make a new P selector here, right? We actually want to add a second attribute or like key value here inside of this paragraph. So I'm going to make a new line and I'm going to say font family sans serif. Oh, actually it's not sans serif, is it? It's monospace. So let's make that monospace. And now you can see it changed all of these to kind of like a code font. You can give this something else too. Like I could put this in quotes and I could say like Comic Sans. Does that work? I think it's Comic Sans MS. Yeah, so you can see it prints in Comic Sans here. You can give it the name of a font. It just has to match something that your computer has. For now, let's just use monospace, though the Comic Sans does give me a kind of fond nostalgia. So P font family, monospace, semicolon. On a new line, we have our second property here, right? So you can add multiple properties into a single P selector or any other CSS selector for that matter. Run the tests and we get another pass. Import a Google font. So in addition to specifying common fonts that are found on most operating systems, we can specify non-standard custom web fonts for use on our website. There are many sources for web fonts on the internet, and for this example, we'll focus on the Google Fonts library. Okay, so there's a lot of additional stuff here, and I'm going to kind of summarize. Google Fonts is a place, it's like a free resource from Google with a bunch of fonts made by font makers that you can import and use in your website. So we're going to pick a font. For this example, we're going to use the Lobster font, which is a super popular web font. So let's come down here and let's see the code and how this works. So to do this, we need to copy the following code snippet and paste it into the top of our code editor before the opening style element. So we have this link tag here, which the link tag is basically an element for importing resources from the internet into your HTML page. So link href, right? That's the same thing as when we made a link in our basic HTML course. And href says where this resource is online. This is at fonts.googleapis.com/CSS family lobster, right? So it's this big link of all kinds of details about where this thing is online. So I just copied that. I'm going to paste it here. You can see if you look at it a little bit more, it's a link with a rel attribute of style sheet and a type of text CSS. What we're doing is actually importing another CSS style sheet. So when you have something like this, list of styles is actually called a style sheet. In this case, we are exporting that from, or should I say, importing that from Google's Font API. An API is an application programming interface. So we're basically saying, we know that Google has all of these external fonts, which live somewhere up in their servers. Let's import that into our HTML file so we can use it here in our code. Okay, so now what we need to do is use that font. So we have this font called Lobster. It says now you can use the Lobster font in your CSS by using Lobster as the family name, as in the following example. So font family, family name, comma, generic name. The generic name is optional and is a fallback font in case another font is not available. This is covered in the next challenge. Family names are case sensitive and need to be wrapped in quotes if there's a space in the name. For example, you need quotes to use the open sans font, right? That's two words, open space sans. You wrap that in quotes, but not to use the Lobster font, which is just one word. In the previous lesson, when I said Comic Sans, it was Comic space sans space MS. So that gets wrapped in quotes. If it's a single word like lobster, it does not need to be in quotes. So import the Lobster font to your web page, then use an element selector to set Lobster as the font family for your H2 element. Okay, so we've already imported that, right? We copy pasted it in earlier. So now let's make another selector here. I'll just do this right here where I say H2 font family And that's set to, and actually, as we said, it doesn't need to be in double quotes, right? So lobster, and then I'll put a semicolon, and you can see now that that changed to the lobster font there. Run the test and we get a pass. Specify how fonts should degrade. So there are several default fonts that are available in all browsers. These generic font families include monospace, serif, and sans serif. When one font isn't available, you can tell the browser to degrade to another font. For example, if you want an element to use the Helvetica font, but degrade to the sans serif font when Helvetica isn't available, you will specify it as follows. So we have this p tag, font family is set to Helvetica, comma, sans serif. Okay, so if Helvetica is there on their machine, use that font. Otherwise, fall back to the default sans serif font. To begin, apply the monospace font to the H2 element so that it now has two fonts, lobster and monospace. So in the last challenge, you imported the lobster font using the link tag. Now comment out that import of the lobster font using the HTML comments you learned before from Google Fonts so that it isn't available anymore. Notice how your H2 element degrades to the monospace font. So first, let's add the monospace font here. So lobster is our default. Now we want to fall back to the monospace font if our lobster font isn't available. Of course, nothing changes because that font is still being imported. Now what we need to do is comment out this link tag. So take a sec. Do you remember how to do HTML comments? We did that in the first basic HTML, which you can find in my description of this video, kind of the going through all of that and how that works. I'll show you how to do it here though, which is that you do angle bracket, exclamation point, dash dash to start or comment, and then you do dash dash right angle bracket to comment that out. You can also do just a little trick. If you're on Mac, you can do command / that's next to your shift key, your right shift key. On Windows, that's control / and that will be the keyboard shortcut for commenting this in and out, which is really useful. So you can see now that lobster is commented out. So yes, it's still looking for that here, but when it's not found because we don't have that font available, it falls back to the monospace font, which you can see here, it's changed to kind of a code looking font. So let's run the tests and we get another pass. Size your images. CSS has a property called width that controls an element's width. Just like with fonts, we'll use px or pixels to specify the image's width. For example, if we wanted to create a CSS class called larger image that gave HTML elements a width of 500 pixels, we'd use, so style tag, and then a class called larger image, which has a property width set to 500 pixels. Create a class called smaller image and use it to resize the image so that it's only 100 pixels wide. Okay, so let's do this under red text. We'll say a class called smaller image, right? So that's dot smaller dash image to indicate a class. And then inside of that, we're gonna set the width property to what? Well, it's a smaller image, and so we want it to be 100 px or pixels. And then we put a semicolon here at the end. Now we need to actually use that image, right? So let's come down here, let's find our image, which is right here. Image source, a cute orange cat lying on its back, bit.ly, FCC relaxing cat. So that's our existing cat image. Now we need to give it a class attribute. And what should we put in here? I'll give you a sec to think about it. So it's going to be smaller image, right? So no period there, kind of like we write dot smaller image here to indicate this is a CSS class. Now to use that down here, we take away the period and we just say class equals smaller image. And you can see that that image gets much, much smaller, specifically 100 pixels wide. We'll run the tests and we get another pass, and we are 1/5 or 20% done with basic CSS. Add borders around your elements. So CSS borders have properties like style, color, and width. For example, if we wanted to create a red 5-pixel border around an HTML element, we could use this class. So style, thin red border, and then inside of that we have 3 different CSS properties: border-color, which is red, border-width, which is 5 pixels, and border/style, not slash dash style, which is solid. So create a class called thick green border. This class should add a 10 pixel solid green border around an HTML element. Apply the class to your cat photo. So remember that you can apply multiple classes to an element using its class attribute by separating each class name with a space. For example, we have our image here, which has class is an attribute, but it has two classes in there, class 1 space class 2. So you can apply multiple CSS classes to a single element. Okay, so we're going to make a class here, make a new line called thick green border. And inside of that, it's going to have a border color of green, right? A border width of, well, it's a thick green border as opposed to a thin one. So this is going to be 10 pixels in width. And then the border style is, that's not how you spell style. Border style is solid, right? So border color green, border width 10 pixels, border style is solid. Now let's come down here and find our image. So we have our image class, smaller image. Okay, well, how do we apply the thick green border here in addition to smaller image? We come here, we make a space, and then we say thick green border. And you can see that it gives it this 10 pixel wide, thick green border around the image. Let's run the test and we get another pass. Add rounded corners with border radius. So your cat photo currently has sharp corners. We can round out those corners with a CSS property called border radius. So you can specify a border radius with pixels, give your cat photo a border radius of 10 pixels. Note this challenge allows for multiple possible solutions. For example, you may add the border radius to either the thick green border class or the smaller image class. So let's go with thick green border, though you can implement this however way you would like. Maybe it'd be worth trying both just so you understand it. So let's come to our thick green border. We need to add another attribute here. So I'll do a new line and I'll say border radius is 10 pixels. And now you can see it actually kind of rounded those corners there. So it's kind of a round image. You could change this to whatever you want. Maybe I'll do like 99999 pixels. You can see it makes it into a circle. So if you're ever wondering how do I make circular images in CSS, you just give it a huge number like this. If you want like a really small one, you can do like 1 pixels. You can see you can't really tell a difference. 3 pixels, you start to see just a little bit of rounding there, etc., etc. 20 pixels would be even more drastic, right? That's like a really rounded rectangle. But what the challenge asks for is just this nice 10 pixel border here. So let's run the tests and we get another pass. In addition to pixels, you can specify the border radius using a percentage. So give your cat photo a border radius of 50%. Oh, so there was actually a challenge about this and I kind of jumped ahead of the curve here. So let's change our border radius to 50%. And you can see that also gives it a circle here, right? So multiple ways you can do this. Honestly, I tend to just give it a huge value. That's just how I learned to do it, but you can do 50% here as well to give it a full circle here. Let's run the tests and we get another pass. Give a background color to a div element. So you can set an element's background color with the background color property. So background dash color set to green. So create a class called silver-background with the background color of silver. Apply this class to your div element. Okay, so right here, I'll make a new class called silver-background. And then I'm going to give it a background dash color of silver. Okay, so now we have this class we can use somewhere. So let's go down and find our div, which is this right here. And now we're going to give it a class of silver dash background. And you can see that it gets that applied in the background of the div. So this is this entire div. This is actually, it's not just this stuff, right? It actually pulls all the way over there. And now all of that gets set to a silver background. Run the tests and we get another pass. Okay, set the ID of an element. So in addition to classes, each HTML element can also have an ID attribute. So there are several benefits to using ID attributes. You can use an ID to style a single element, and later you'll learn that you can use them to select and modify specific elements with JavaScript. ID attributes should be unique. Browsers won't enforce this, but it is a widely agreed upon best practice. That's true. So please don't give more than one element the same ID attribute. And I'll say, just to add on to that, when they say please don't give more than one element ID attribute, that's not for like other people, that's for you. If you set multiple things with an ID, you will not be able to target a specific element with an ID in the way that it's intended for. So just be aware of that. It's a common mistake that beginner programmers make. So here's an example of how you give your H2 element the ID of cat photo app. It's just another attribute, right? H2 ID equals cat photo app. So it says give your form element the ID cat photo form. Let's come down and find our form here at the bottom. Form action here. So let's just give it an ID attribute equals cat photo form. Nothing will change here, right? Because we're just setting this kind of invisible attribute, but we just set it to ID cat photo form. Run the test and we get a pass. Use an ID attribute to style an element. One cool thing about ID attributes is that, like classes, you can style them using CSS. However, an ID is not reusable and should only be applied to one element. An ID also has a higher specificity or importance than a class. So if both are applied to the same element and have conflicting styles, the styles of the ID will be applied. Here's an example of how you can take your element with the ID attribute of cat photo element and give it the background color of green. So in your style element, cat photo element, importantly here, there's this hash, right? Hash is how we indicate an ID. So a class starts with a period here, right? Dot red text. An ID selector starts with a hash. Try giving your form, which now has the ID attribute of cat photo form, a green background. So we come down here, we find our form, right? ID equals cat photo form. I'm just going to copy this. Now we want to target this form by its ID. So we will come up here and we'll say hash or pound cat photo form, right? So dot silver background says target this class of silver background, and then cat photo form with a hash in front of it, or pound, whatever you want to call it, that is targeting this ID. So cat photo form, background color set to green. And now you can see that got set to green here. Okay, so again, the difference here is that CSS classes like red text, dot red text here, these are targeting the class attribute, right? H2 class equals red text, P class equals red text, and these can be used multiple times. So you can use red text on every single element in this page without any problem. An ID, such as form ID cat photo form, should only be used for one element. So it's a very, very specific way of referring to one thing, such as our form. So let's run the test and we get a pass. Okay, adjust the padding of an element. So we'll put our cat photo app away for a while and learn more about styling HTML. You may already have noticed this, but all HTML elements are essentially little rectangles. 3 important elements control the space that surrounds each HTML element: padding, border, and margin. An element's padding controls the amount of space between the element's content and its border. Here we can see that the blue box and the red box are nested within the yellow box. Note that the red box has more padding than the blue box. Okay, so we come up here and look, we have our blue box, which has a little bit of padding here. That is the space between the text here and the outside of the box, right? Or the kind of edge of it. So we have this little bit of padding right here on the top and the bottom, and then we have this large amount of padding here on the right-hand side. This red one has significantly more vertical padding here, right? So it actually ends up being a lot larger. And then we also have this margin, which is surrounding that. I think this one's just about padding though, huh? We'll get to margin here in a sec. Okay, so change the padding of your blue box to match that of your red box. So let's look at our CSS here. We have injected text, box, yellow box, red box, blue box. So we want to change the padding of our blue box to match that of our red box. So red box has a padding of 20 pixels and blue box has a padding of 10 pixels. So let's change this to 20. And now you can see that the spacing here is the same, right? So this is 20 pixels of padding now. If I change this to 1 pixel, you can see how big of a difference that makes. I could even change this to like 1,000 pixels and it literally goes off the screen. Let's try 100. right? You can see that makes a big difference here. Let's make this 20 to match the red box and run our tests, and we get a pass. So adjust the margin of an element. An element's margin controls the amount of space between an element's border and surrounding elements. So here we can see the blue box and the red box are nested within the yellow box. Note that the red box has a bigger margin than the blue box, making it appear smaller. When you increase the blue box's margin, it will increase the distance between its border and the surrounding elements. Okay, so our margin here is the distance between this border of our blue box and the border of the red box. So this little space of yellow right here is our margin. And so what you need to do is change the margin of the blue box to match that of the red box. So our red box has 20 pixels of margin here. Let's set our blue box to also have 20 pixels of margin, and you can see it adds a little bit of spacing here. So we can show you what it looks like by just changing that slightly. So 2 pixels makes that a lot more drastic. 20 pixels evens out the amount of both horizontal margin as well as vertical margin. So let's run the tests and we get a pass. Add a negative margin to an element. So an element's margin controls the amount of space between an element's border and surrounding elements. If you set an element's margin to a negative value, the element will grow larger. Okay, so try to set the margin to a negative value like the one for the red box. Change the margin of the blue box to negative 15 pixels so that it fills the entire horizontal width of the yellow box around it. Okay, so our blue box here currently has a margin of 20 pixels. And you can see that's reflected here with the spacing or gap between the corner or the edge of the yellow box and what we have for the blue box. Let's change this to negative 15 pixels. And you can see, just like the red box here, it's going to actually fill up the entire yellow box. So if we set this to 0, you can see this is actually the default without any margin, right? If I set this to -10, you can see it almost covers it evenly. But then if I set it to 15 here, they all sort of collapse in together and the blue box perfectly fits into the yellow box. So we'll run the test and we get another pass. So add different padding to each side of an element. Sometimes you want to customize an element so that it has different amounts of padding on each of its sides. So CSS allows you to control the padding of all 4 individual sides of an element with the padding top, padding right, padding bottom, and padding left properties. Give the blue box a padding of 40 pixels on its top and left side, but only 20 pixels on its bottom and right side. Okay, so let's come down to blue box here. Right now we have no padding, right? And what we want to do is say padding top is set to 40 pixels, padding left is set to 40 pixels, padding bottom is set to 20 pixels, and padding right is also set to 20 pixels. That's actually the same as it is here, right? Left, 40, bottom, yeah, so you could actually use this as a reference too. So you can set individual instead of padding across, top, left, bottom, right. You can do them individually per side, top, left, bottom, right, and you get this formatting like it looks here. We'll run the test and we get another pass. Add different margins to each side of an element. So sometimes you want to customize an element that has a different margin on each of its sides. This is just like the padding example. You can set margin top, margin right, margin bottom, and margin left. Give the blue box a margin of 40 pixels on its top and left side, but only 20 pixels on its bottom and right side. And so real quick, it is worth mentioning, like looking at this example over here, you can see that the reason this matters is that the padding in the past example affected like the content inside of this, right? So the text kind of got shuffled off into the right side of the box. The margin here actually affects the box itself and where it renders inside of this yellow thing. So this blue one is kind of even, right? So there's an even amount of space or margin between this border here and the end of this yellow box. The margin here, when we affect it by setting left or bottom or top or right to different values, is it effectively moves the box inside of the yellow container. So let's do that with the blue box here as well. Margin top is set to 40 pixels. Margin right is set to 20 pixels. margin left is set to 40 pixels, and margin bottom is set to 20 pixels. And effectively, we end up moving it the same way or the same amount as the red box here. So you can see it's a little bit more spacing on the left-hand side than the right-hand side. That's 40 pixels on the left-hand side and 20 pixels on the right-hand side. Let's run the tests and we get another pass. Use clockwise notation to specify the padding of an element. So instead of specifying an element's padding top, right, bottom, and left properties, you can specify them all in one line like this. Padding set to 10 pixels, 20 pixels, 10 pixels, 20 pixels. These 4 values work like a clock. That is top, I'm going to do it on the camera here, top, right, bottom, and left. So like we're going around a clock. Did I do that right? Right, bottom, left. It might be mirrored, so I apologize, but just imagine you're looking at a clock in front of you, right? So padding top, right, bottom, left. So let's use clockwise notation to give Blue Box a padding of 40 pixels on its top and left side, but only 20 pixels on its bottom and right side. So Blue Box here, we'll go to padding, and now we want to do clockwise notation. So top, which is our first value, is 40 pixels. Our next one is going to be, top right, right? So that's going to be 20 pixels. Bottom is going to be 20 pixels, and then left is going to be 40 pixels. Okay, so let's run the tests and we get another pass. Okay, so use clockwise notation to specify the margin of an element. Exactly the same thing, except this time we're going to be using margin. So same thing, margin top, right, bottom, and left. Instead, we can use this single value margin with clockwise notation. So use clockwise notation to give the element with Blue Box class a margin of 40 pixels on top and left side, but only 20 pixels on its bottom and right side. So very, very similar margin here. We're going to start with the top, which is 40 pixels, then the right, which is 20 pixels, the bottom, which is 20 pixels, and the left, which is 40 pixels. So that will be top, right, bottom, and left. We'll run the tests and we get another pass. And we're 50% done, or halfway, with the basic CSS challenges. Use attribute selectors to style elements. You've been adding ID or class attributes to elements that you wish to specifically style. These are known as ID and class selectors. There are other CSS selectors you can use to select custom groups of elements to style. So for this challenge, you will use the square bracket adder or attribute equals value, and then close square bracket, attribute selector to style the checkboxes in our cat photo app. This selector matches and styles elements with a specific attribute value. For example, the below code changes the margins of all elements with the attribute type and a corresponding value of radio. So we have this selector here, which says square bracket type equals radio, and then close bracket. So that is specifying anything that has an attribute of type set to radio. We come down here, let's look at our form, right? So we have type is equal to radio. So this is going to target this input, these two right here, right? Because it matches this type equals radio, but not type equals checkbox, type equals checkbox, type equals checkbox. So it's looking up the type attribute here, right? But it's matching only radio, not checkbox. So using the type attribute selector, try to give the checkboxes in Cat Photo app a top margin of 10 pixels and a bottom margin of 15 pixels. So let's make a new CSS selector. We'll say type equals what? Well, it's going to be checkbox. So type equals checkbox, and then inside of that, we're going to give it a margin, right? So we'll say margin. And then what we want to do here is let's use the clockwise notation, which we know is top, right, bottom, and left. So our top margin is going to be 10 pixels. Okay, well, what is our right margin going to be, right? It hasn't asked for a right margin here. So let's just put 0. We'll say that won't have a right margin. The bottom margin is going to be 15 pixels, and then the left margin is going to be 0 as well. Semicolon to end that line. You know, of course, the alternate way you could do this is you could say like margin top 10 pixels, margin bottom 15 pixels. And you can see if I comment that out, whoops, that won't work. I'll comment it this way. So if you can see if I comment that out, it doesn't make a difference, right? They're functionally the same. as if I commented these out and then I just use this one. But this way is just a one-liner of doing it a little bit faster. So just a little bit bonus credit there if you want to try and use that one. So we run the test and we get another pass. Understand absolute versus relative units. So the last several challenges all set in elements of margin or padding with pixels. Pixels are a type of length unit, which is what tells the browser how to size and space an item. In addition to px or pixels, CSS has a number of different length unit options that you can use. The two main types of length units are absolute and relative. Absolute units tie to physical units of length, for example, inches or millimeters. Absolute length units approximate the actual measurement on a screen, but there are some differences depending on a screen's resolution. So relative units such as em, or rem, are relative to another length value. For example, em is based on the size of an element's font. If you use it to set the font size property itself, it's relative to the parent's font size. There are several relative unit options that are tied to the size of the viewport. That is, the viewport being your HTML sort of window or page where everything is getting rendered into. I'm sure that'll be explained later on. So for now, let's add a padding property to the element with class redBox and set it to 1.5 em. Okay, so let's find our red box and we're going to add a padding here and we're going to set it to 1.5 em. And that gives it a padding here. So right now, I'm sure this will be explained later. And also you can do more research on this if you're interested. In em and rem values are relative to the font size on your page, right? So if I have 16 pixels, again, this probably isn't the exact math, but just to give you a sense of how it works, like say that everything on my page is 16 pixels, 1.5 em is going to be a relative like fractional value. I would assume 150% or 1.5 times. So I'm not sure on that because I'm not a CSS expert. I know the basics. But you can think of it as like relative to the general font size on your screen. If I'm wrong about that, let me know in the comments. I'm happy to be wrong and to not have a great understanding of it. I would love to learn more, like everyone else. But instead of providing a specific pixel value here, right, like 20 pixels or 40 pixels, 1.5 em is relative to font size. So let's run the test and we get another pass. Style the HTML body element. Now let's start fresh and talk about CSS inheritance. Every HTML page has a body element. We can prove that the body element exists here by giving it a background color of black. Okay, so let's do that. In fact, I'm just going to copy it because we know exactly what needs to happen here, right? So let's paste it in and let's prove that yes, the body class does exist. It sets everything here to black. So every HTML page has this body element that has everything inside of it. We learned this in our basic HTML course, right? In the past video, where I believe the last or second to last example was adding both a head and a body element inside of our HTML page. You know, we could change this to like pink. You can see it changes the whole thing. In this case, we'll change it to black. Again, you can see that it updates the entire page with this black value. Let's run the test and we get another pass. Inherit styles from the body element. So now that we've proven every HTML page has a body element and that its body element can also be styled with CSS. Remember, you can style your body element just like any other HTML element, and all your other elements will inherit your body element styles. So first, create an h1 element with the text hello world. So let's do that real quick. h1 hello world. Now let's give all elements on your page the color of green by adding color green to your body element's style declaration. Okay, let's do that. So color is set to green and you can see, boom, that shows up right there, right? So importantly, it has inherited it from the body, right? So if you look at your HTML page, you have a body, which is the huge kind of whole content of the page, the overarching element of the page. Inside of that, we have an h1, and the h1 will inherit the color green from the body tag that it is inside of. So this is a really important concept. If we actually come in here, say I right click this and I go to inspect, which lets me see my HTML content in this developer tools, which you should have access to if you're in Chrome. You can do this with any page. So just right click and go to inspect. I'll make this font size a little bit bigger. So you can see that we actually have this body here, right? Body ID equals display body, style, margin 8 pixels. Okay, so this is our body. And inside of that, we have this H1. And so if I set a style here of body and say color green, that gets inherited from any, from its parent element, right? So body has an H1. I can even scroll down here and look at these styles here, and I can see that my body here, it has this color green that is getting inherited, or the H1 is inheriting that color green value. Okay, so the last thing is to give your body element the font family of monospace by adding font family monospace. I'll just copy that and paste it into my body attribute or CSS selector here, right? And once again, just like the color, that is also being, or the H1 is also inheriting that from my body. Run the test and we get another pass. Okay, so prioritize one style over another. Sometimes your HTML elements will receive multiple styles that conflict with each other. For example, your H1 element can't be both green and pink at the same time. So let's see what happens when we create a class that makes text pink, then apply it to an element. Will our class override the body element's color green CSS property? So create a CSS class called pink text that gives an element the color pink. Okay, so come down here, I'll say pink text. This will be color pink. And now give your H1 element the class of pink text. So before I do that, what do you think is going to happen? I'll give you a second to think about it and think about kind of what we talked about in the last lesson with inheriting CSS. And there was also some stuff earlier about ID and class and this idea of importance between CSS classes, which one is picked and which one has like higher precedence is kind of what we refer to that as sometimes. What do you think is going to happen? So if I add pink text, you can see that it sets it to pink, right? The reason for that is that this H1 class has a higher priority in how CSS renders your screen or renders your HTML because it's specifically targeting this H1. So H1 has a class of pink text. So that color has a higher priority than the overarching color that comes from body. So let's run the test and we get another pass. Override styles in subsequent CSS. So our pink text class overrode our body element's CSS declaration. We just proved that our classes will override the body's element CSS. So the next logical question is, what can we do to override our pink text class? So let's create an additional CSS class called blue text that gives an element the color blue. Make sure that it is below your pink text class declaration. Okay, so we'll say blue text is set to color blue. Now apply the blue text class to your H1 element in addition to your pink text class, and let's see which one wins. So applying multiple class attributes to an HTML element is done. Well, we already know about this. It's class equals class 1 space class 2, right? So we'll say pink text and then blue text. And you can see it does change to blue here. Note, it doesn't matter which order the classes are listed in the HTML element. And we can prove this. Let's just delete pink text here, and then let's add it here towards the bottom or towards the end of our class attribute, right? Blue text, pink text still is blue here. So it doesn't matter which order you put them in inside of this class attribute. However, the order of the class declarations in the style section is what is important. The second declaration will always take precedence over the first. Because blue text is declared second, it overrides the attributes of pink text. So we can confirm that if we just copy this and paste it here. You can see because pink text comes after blue text, it will take precedence here and it will render as pink. Let me just undo that. So that's an interesting mechanic or property of CSS that you need to be aware of. Run the tests and we get another pass. Override class declarations by styling ID attributes. So we just proved that browsers read CSS from top to bottom in order of their declaration. This means that in the event of a conflict, the browser will use whatever CSS declaration came last. notice that even if we had put blue text before pink text in our h1 elements classes, it would still look at the declaration order and not the order of their use, right? So we switched blue text and pink text down here, and it didn't make an impact at all, right? So we're not done yet. There are other ways that you can override CSS, specifically ID attributes. So let's override your pink text and blue text classes and make your h1 element orange by giving them an h1 element, an ID, and then styling that ID. So give your h1 element the ID attribute of orange text. So let's come down here. We'll make a space here and say ID equals orange text. We haven't defined that yet, right? So nothing changes here. But now we need to create a CSS declaration for your orange text ID in your style element. So I'll give you a sec to think about that. How would you do that? Maybe try and do it real quick before I implement it. So an orange text here, it's an ID, and of course it should have color set to orange. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to say pound or hash here, right? Which says this is an ID, as opposed to the period here, which is a class. Orange text is set to color orange. And you can see it does actually change the color here to orange. So IDs have a higher specificity or like priority or precedence, whatever you want to refer to it as, than classes. So you can set class to pink or blue or whatever, and it will render based on the order that it's defined in the style sheet. But if you then define ID, like orange text, that will take precedence over all of those. So IDs have an even higher precedence than classes. Let's run the text and we get complete, and we're 2/3 done with this. So override class declarations with inline styles. So we've proven that ID declarations override class declarations regardless of where they're declared in your style element CSS. So there are other ways, even more ways. It's never ending, the things you can do in CSS. There are other ways that you can override CSS. Do you remember inline styles? So use an inline style to try and make our h1 element white. So remember, inline styles look like this. It's a style attribute where we put our CSS pairs in here, our key, which is color, and our value, which is green. That's like the very first CSS declaration that we did at the beginning of this section. Okay, so we're going to add an inline style to make our h1 element white. So let's do that by coming here and saying style equals, and then our key here is going to be color, and our value is going to be white. And then we'll put a semicolon here. You can see it's changed the color here, white. So again, class are kind of the lowest in terms of precedence. ID is next, and then inline styles are even higher. We'll run the tests and we'll see that we get a pass. Override all other styles by using important. So we just proved that inline styles will override all the CSS declarations in your style element. But wait, there's one last way to override CSS. I wasn't kidding. There are literally so many ways to have CSS precedence all over the place. This is the most powerful method of all. But before we do it, let's talk about why you would ever want to override CSS. Why are we doing all this? It's a great question. In many situations, you will use CSS libraries. So CSS libraries are collections of other people's CSS that they've written. Often for me, let's say it is people who are much better at CSS than I am. They are like designers and really talented designer-developer combos who are really good at writing CSS, which I'm not. So you have these CSS libraries that set a bunch of styles, just like we're doing here, but on a much larger scale. So in many situations, you will use CSS libraries. These may accidentally override your own CSS. So when you absolutely need to be sure that an element has specific CSS, you can use !important. So let's go all the way back to our pink text class declaration. Remember that our pink text class was overridden by subsequent class declarations, ID declarations, and inline styles. So let's add the keyword !important, I'll just say important from now on, to your pink text element's color declaration to make 100% sure that your h1 element will be pink. So an example of how to do this is color red, right? So color : red. Then you put a space here and say !important. So we're adding this keyword here, important, into our CSS. And so to do that, let's come and find our pink text here, and we're going to make it important. So we'll come after pink and say space important. This says, hey, this color pink is the most important and it should override everything else, whether that's orange text or blue text or our inline style. The pink text here is the most important. That takes precedence over everything else, and you can see that it gets set to pink. Run the test and we get another pass. Use hex code for specific colors. So did you know there are other ways to represent colors in CSS? One of these ways is called hexadecimal code, or hex code for short. We usually use decimals or base 10 numbers, that's 0 through 9. Oh, it says there, which use the symbol 0 to 9 for each digit, right? Hexadecimal numbers, or hex, are base 16 numbers. This means it uses 16 distinct symbols. So like decimals, the symbols 0 to 9 represent the values 0 to 9. Then A, B, C, D, and F represent the values 10 to 15. So altogether, 0 to F can represent a digit in hexadecimal, giving us 16 possible values. And then there's also a link here to find out more about hexadecimal numbers, or base 16 if you'd like. So in CSS, we use 6 hexadecimal digits to represent colors, 2 each for red, green, and blue. And for example, hash 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 digits here. So 0, 0, 0, 0, whoops, 0, 0, and 0, 0 is black and is also the lowest possible value. So let's break that down real quick. So a hexadecimal number is represented with this hash here, and then it has 3 pairs of 2-digit numbers. So this is our red, which is set to 0, 0. Our green, which is also set to 0, 0, and our blue, which is also set to 0, 0. So that indicates basically how much red, how much green, and how much blue are in this color. Black is an absence of all of those, right? There is no red, no green, no black. And so it's 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. So the ask here is to replace the word black in our body's element's background color with its hex code representation, which is just 6 zeros preceded by the hash or pound. So let's take this, replace it with a hash, and say 1, 2, that's our red, 1, 2, that's our green, 1, 2, that's our blue. So no red, no green, no black. 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, that indicates black. For a really long time, I didn't understand at all how the hex code stuff worked. I think it's actually really useful and kind of interesting to understand how that works, and why, not only just knowing, like most programmers who've written any CSS know that this is black, but a lot of people don't understand the why, how the red, the green, and the blue play together. So I think that's important and worth knowing. Though you can open this tab here and learn more about the RGB color model and how that works if you're interested. So let's run the test and we get another pass. So use hex code to mix colors. So to review hex code, use 6 hexadecimal digits to represent colors. That's what we just talked about. From these 3 pure colors, red, green, and blue, we can vary the amounts of each to create over 16 million other colors. So for example, orange is pure red mixed with some green and no blue. In hex code, this translates to being pound FFA500. So the digit 0 is the lowest number in hex code and represents a complete absence of color. The digit F is the highest number in hex code and represents the maximum possible brightness. So the way to think about this is, if we have orange, which is, like they said, pure red mixed with some green and no blue. So we have our hex code here, which is red, green, and blue, right? So our red here is FF, which is the highest digit number, right? So FF, meaning these 2 digits are both at their maximum value, which is F. So that's all red, as much red as we can get. A5 is some green here, right? So A is kind of in the middle between 0 and F. 5 is much less, but still some, right? So you can kind of think of it as like a middle amount of green. And then 0, 0 is the absence of blue entirely, right? So 0 is our lowest number. So FFA500, as much red as we can get, some green, no blue. So the ask here is to replace the color words in our style element with their correct hex codes. So Dodger blue, green, red, orange, and red. Okay, so let's start with Dodger blue. I'm going to copy this hex code and I'm going to replace Dodger blue text here with that color. So 1E90FF. So our red here, we have a very, very small amount of red. 1E is, on the low end here. 90, which is our green value, a decent amount of green. 90, right? If 0 to F is our kind of scale, a 9 is kind of in the middle there. And then FF, which is as much blue as we can get, maximum possible brightness for blue. That's our Dodger blue. Green here is, let's type this one in, why not? It'll be pound 00FF00. This is like pure green, right? So red here, we have an absence of red entirely, 00, which is the lowest value. Green, which is FF, which is the highest possible brightness. And then blue, which is, I'm trying to figure out on my camera here which the right place is. So a total absence of blue as well. Pure green, 00FF00. Let's copy the rest of these in. I think you're starting to get the point. Orange here, FFA500. Maximum red, a little bit of green, no blue. And then red here, which is FF0000. Maximum amount of red, no green. Run the tests and we get a pass here, and we are 3/4 done with basic CSS. So use abbreviated hex code. Many people feel overwhelmed by the possibilities of more than 16 million colors, and it's difficult to remember hex code. Fortunately, you can shorten it. So for example, red's hex code can be shortened. So it's FF0000 can be shortened to F00. The shortened form gives 1 digit for red, 1 digit for green, and 1 digit for blue. So this reduces the total number of possible colors to around 4,000, but browsers will interpret FF0000 and F00 as exactly the same color. So go ahead and try using the abbreviated hex codes to color the correct elements. So here's a fun one. Let's start with red here. So not looking at the screen on the left-hand side, can you guess what this would be? So if we have RGB, which is our 3 shortened hex codes, so RGB, what would our red text be? Think about it for just a second. If you remember my explanation of how hex codes work, what would be the correct value here if we only have 3 values or 3 digits to work with? Well, we know that red is our first one here, right? Our first digit, and we want the maximum possible brightness. This is going to be F. And then our other ones, we're going to have an absence of green and blue, right? So this is going to be 0, 0. Fuchsia is going to be both red and blue together. So this one is going to be F0F. That's going to turn it fuchsia. Cyan is going to be both green and blue, but not red. So that one's going to be 0FF. And then green is going to be an absence of both red and blue, but full green, right? So that's going to be, let's see, 0F0. And that will turn that green. It's really useful, I think, to know, like I said, how the hex colors work, because there's this whole thing here about like memorizing colors and like, reducing the total number of possible colors. If you're just doing like pure reds and pure greens, it can be really useful just to understand like, oh, like green is always going to be 0F0, or even like 00FF00, and understanding how the hex colors work together, I think is really useful. Let's run the test and we get another pass. Use RGB values to color elements. So another way you can represent colors in CSS is by using RGB values. The RGB value for black looks like this. So RGB 0, 0, 0, and this is in parentheses here. The RGB value for white looks like this. RGB, and then in parentheses, 255, 255, 255, and then end parentheses. Instead of using 6 hexadecimal digits like you do with hex code, with RGB you specify the brightness of each color with a number between 0 and 255. If you do the math, the 2 digits for one color equals 16 times 16, which gives us 256 total values. So what does that mean? Well, they're saying in a hex code, you have 2 digits, right? For red, you have 0F or 0 to F, 0 to F, 2 digits. If you multiply those together, the total number that you have of values there is 256. So RGB, which starts counting from 0, has the exact same number of possible values as hex code. So what that means is if you go from 0 all the way to 255, that represents every possible combination of those 2 hexadecimal digits. It's kind of complicated. Don't worry about it too much, and just know that each of these can go from 0 to 255. So here's an example of how you change the body background to orange using its RGB code. So body is set to background color, RGB 255165.0. So again, we have our red, which is full brightness. That's our maximum value. So our 255 corresponds to FF, right? Which is our full brightness in hex code. 165, which is kind of halfway-ish, a little bit over halfway in our green, so a little bit of green, and then blue, which is 0, no blue whatsoever, right? So that's going to be our orange color. So let's replace the hex code in our body element's background color with the RGB value for black. That is RGB 0, 0, 0. So let's replace that and say RGB 0, 0, 0. Right? No red, no green, no blue. Let's run the tests and we get another pass. So just like hex code, you can mix colors in RGB by using combinations of different values. Okay, so replace the hex codes in our style elements with their correct RGB values. Once again, for these simple ones, let's say red and blue, let's try and do them without looking here on the left-hand side. I'll actually block it with my mic so I can't see it. So our red text here, let's replace this with RGB. How do we write red text here? Well, we know that our red is the first number here. What is a maximum value here? It's going to be 255, right? So that's our 16 times 16, which is 256. Starting at 0, our maximum value is 255. Our green is going to be 0, so no green. And then our blue is also going to be 0. So no blue there, right? So 255, 0, 0, that is our pure red color. Blue is going to be the same thing, but in the blue value, so we're going to say no red, no green, full blue, 255, we get blue there. Okay, and now orchid here is going to be, I'll just write this by hand, so RGB 218, so 218 red, 112 green, and then 214 blue. That's our orchid. And then sienna is going to be 160 red, 82 green, and 45 blue. You also notice that, like, this is more sort of color theory here, but you'll notice that these values are lower, right? So 160, 82, 45. This has a lower kind of relative brightness than this color. This color is brighter, right? You can see it literally has more brightness value in being the orchid color than the sienna. So that's an interesting sort of property where not only do you have red, greens, and blues in terms of like what comprises the actual color, you also have this scale of 0 to 255 in terms of like what are just brighter colors on your screen, right? So a white, which is, 255, 255, 255, that's like maximum brightness. You're not going to find something brighter on the screen than these pure whites here in the background, but you will find that like the orchid color is brighter on your screen. It's closer to whites here than sienna is. So it's an interesting color theory thing. Something, frankly, I didn't understand until recently, and it's totally okay if you have no idea what I'm talking about, but just start to think about that. Like some of these colors literally have just like higher values here than these other ones. And they gives it a property of being brighter, depending on the different colors. So let's run the tests here and we get another pass. So use CSS variables to change several elements at once. CSS variables are a powerful way to change many CSS style properties at once by only changing one value. Follow the instructions below to see how changing just 3 values can change the styling of many elements. So in the Penguin class, change the black value to gray, the gray value to white, and the yellow value to orange. Okay, so we have our penguin class here, and you can see there's a bunch of CSS here, right? A bunch of stuff that you have no idea what it is, never seen it before. And it's drawing this penguin in pure CSS, which is really cool. Now what we want to do is we want to change these variables here. So you can see dash dash penguin dash skin is set to black, right? This is what's called a CSS variable. A variable is a way of kind of storing something, storing a value with a certain name. And we'll learn more about that as we get into things like JavaScript, I'm sure. Penguin skin here, dash dash penguin skin is set to black. So what we can do here is we can refer to this in other places in our CSS, right? So background var is set to dash dash penguin comma gray. So we're saying refer to this penguin skin variable. And just to show you what happens, let's change the black value here to gray, like it says. You can see it changes, it loses part of its skin, which is a little scary. The gray value to white, okay? And then the beak, yellow to orange. And you can see we've now changed the entire color scheme, basically this penguin. Let's undo that and see what it looked like before. And then let's change it again. So you can see you can use variables to change multiple things, because penguin skin is used here, it's used here, it's used here, it's used all over the place, right? Penguin belly. So it's a way for us to reuse code or reuse values across our entire CSS. Penguin skin, penguin belly, penguin beak. Let's run the tests and we get another pass. So create a custom CSS variable. To create a CSS variable, you need to give it a name with 2 hyphens in front of it and assign it a value like this. So dash dash penguin skin is set to gray. This will create a variable named penguin skin and assign it the value of gray. Now you can use that variable elsewhere in your CSS to change the value of other elements to gray. In the penguin class, create a variable named penguin skin and give it a value of gray. So right here, we're going to say penguin skin. So dash dash penguin skin. You can see it just messed it up, but we'll fix that in a sec. Colon gray. That's going to be our penguin skin value here, right? So now we can use this penguin skin other places in our code because we've set that CSS variable. Let's run the tests and we get another pass. Use a custom CSS variable, right? So we set our CSS variable. Now let's actually use it. So after you create your variable, you can assign its value to other CSS properties by referencing the name that you gave it. So background, and then we use this var here, which is variable. So we say variable dash dash penguin skin. So use that penguin skin variable. This will change the background of whatever element you're targeting to gray because that is the value of the penguin skin variable. Note the styles will not be applied unless the variable names are an exact match. So you can't just say like dash dash penguin dash skin color, right? It needs to exactly match this variable that we use. So let's apply the penguin skin variable to the background property of the penguin top, penguin bottom, right hand, and left hand classes. So we'll start with penguin top here. You can see there's this little section, change code below this line and above this line. So this is the line of code we want to change. This is going to be, well, let's start from the beginning here. Let's delete this. You can see that our penguin loses its skin here. We want to give this a background property, right? So background. And then we want to use the penguin skin CSS variable. So it's not, importantly, it's not this, right? It's not penguin skin. Why is that? Well, the reason is that we need to tell CSS that we're using a variable here. So to do that, let's wrap it in this variable parentheses. And now you can see var penguin skin. That sets it here to that gray value, which we defined up here. So let's copy this line. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down here to penguin bottom. I'm going to paste it. Right hand, I'm going to paste it. Left hand, I'm going to paste, right? And so now we're using this variable all over the place. And of course, like we talked about in the very first CSS variable lesson, now I can change this to something else, right? I could set it to pink. I could set it to red. I could set it to whatever, right? That variable is being used across all of those different places. And so it will update automatically. Let's change that back to gray. Let's run our tests and we get a pass. So attach a fallback value to a CSS variable. When using your variable as a CSS property value, you can attach a fallback value so that your browser will revert to if the given variable is invalid. So note this fallback is not used to increase browser compatibility, and it will not work on Internet Explorer browsers. Welcome to the beginnings of the pain that is sometimes writing CSS that works across multiple browsers, which is a whole topic of its own. But in this case, this will not work on Internet Explorer browsers, but it's used if the browser has a color to display if it cannot find your variable. So here's how you do it. You say background var -- penguin skin, comma, black. So this says it will set background to black if your variable wasn't set. So this is a really useful way to say, if I forget to define penguin skin or penguin belly or penguin beak, fall back to this other value that I know is like a color of some kind, like black or gray or yellow. So it looks like there is a problem with the variables supplied to the penguin top and penguin bottom classes. Rather than fix the typo, add a fallback value of black to the background property of penguin top and penguin bottom. Okay, so let's find penguin top. That's this here. Background is this variable penguin skin, but there's a typo here. Penguin is spelled wrong. We want to, instead of fixing that for right now, that's not what the exercise calls for. We want to give it a fallback value. Because this variable is not going to be found, let's give it a fallback value of black. And now you can see that gets set here properly. Same thing down here. This can't be found, so let's set it to black. Is it just those two? Yeah, penguin top and penguin bottom. So instead of fixing this typo, which we obviously could do and you probably would want to do in your own code, we're showing that if that variable can't be found, we can still fall back to a known value such as black here. Run the tests and we get a pass. So improve compatibility with browser fallbacks. When working with CSS, you will likely run into browser compatibility issues at some point, which is what I was talking about earlier. Different browsers implement CSS differently, which is very unfortunate. It's really frustrating, but it is what we got. It's what we work with. That is why it's important to provide browser fallbacks to avoid potential problems. When your browser parses the CSS of a web page, it ignores any properties that it doesn't recognize or support. For example, if you use a CSS variable to assign a background color on a site, Internet Explorer will ignore the background color because it does not support CSS variables. In that case, the browser will use whatever value it has for that property. If it cannot find any other value set for that property, it will revert to the default value, which is typically not ideal. This means that if you do not want to provide a browser fallback, it's as easy as providing another more widely supported value immediately before your declaration. That way, an older browser will have something to fall back on, while a new browser will just interpret whatever declaration comes later in the cascade. It's a lot of information, so let me show you the challenge and I'll explain to you what this means. So it looks like a variable is being used to set the background color of the red box class. Let's improve our browser compatibility by adding another background declaration right before the existing declaration and set its value to red. Okay, so the ask here is in the red box CSS class, if the browser does not support this CSS variable, so var set to red color, which is this one up here, we need to fall back to a known value for browsers that don't support CSS variables. So we're just going to say background is set to red. Okay, what's going to happen here is that because CSS reads from top to bottom, for browsers that do not support CSS variables, it's going to see background set to red. Very simple CSS declaration, right? It will understand that and say, oh, okay, this background is red. If you're on most browsers, like newer browsers, not even super new browsers, literally just like things that are Internet Explorer, like really the majority of browsers will continue after that. And it will say background is set to the CSS variable red color. All of those browsers will look at this. But the problem is if you do not have this defined, right? If it's not set and something like Internet Explorer only sees this line of code, it will say like, I don't know what to do with that, right? And it will render whatever the default is. Probably in this case it would be like white. It would probably just render a white background, which is not ideal. So we add this background red here as a fallback for older browsers. Let's run the tests and we get a pass. Okay, inherit CSS variables. When you create a variable, it is available for you to use inside the selector in which you create it. It also is available in any of that selector's descendants, that is, like children of that selector. This happens because CSS variables are inherited just like ordinary properties. So remember inheritance. Remember in a previous lesson, we had our body where we set a color. The H2 inside of that body inherited that color, right? And in the same way, CSS variables are also inherited in our children or descendants of our CSS and our HTML together, I guess you could say. To make use of inheritance, CSS variables are often defined in the :root element. So the root element is a pseudo class selector. So pseudo class kind of means like a, how would you describe it? A not particularly real class. It's like it just is set in CSS, and CSS knows what to do with it, but it's not necessarily a real CSS like selector class that you can use in your HTML. But it's a pseudo class selector that matches the root element of the document, usually the HTML element. So it's kind of like an alias you can think of, or like a shortcut, I guess you could say, where a :root is, it matches whatever the very top element of your HTML page is. Most of the time this is the HTML element. If you remember in our basic HTML and HTML5, we wrote our from scratch HTML document, which started with that HTML tag. That is our root here. That's what this root is going to target. So by creating your variables in root, they will be available globally and can be accessed from any other selector in the style sheet. So define a variable named penguin belly in the root selector and give it the value of pink. You can then see that the variable is inherited and that all child elements which use it get pink backgrounds. So we have our root selector defined here, and what we want to do is define a variable called penguin belly. So -- penguin belly. We're going to give it a value of pink. And now you can see all over the place, all of these things get this penguin belly assigned, right? So body has this background, which is var penguin belly. Right cheek has a background of penguin belly. Left cheek has a value of penguin belly. So all of these get this value set, right? Let's look at how this actually works. If I right click here again and I say inspect element, if I come here, this is my content of my page, right? You see if I highlight this and I press right arrow, I can expand this. I can see my penguin here. This is all of my code. If I come to this HTML here, this is that root element that we're talking about, right? So HTML, I have this highlighted. You can see I have the style here where penguin belly is set to pink. So this is my root element. This is what that pseudo selector or pseudo class selector targets here. So yeah, that's how that works. Let's run the tests and we get a pass, and I would guess we're maybe 1 or 2 away. Let's see, is this the last one? Maybe we have 2 more. I'm not really sure. Okay, so change a variable for a specific area. When you create your variables in :root, they will set the value of the variable for the whole page. You can then overwrite these variables by setting them again within a specific element. So change the value of penguin belly to white in the penguin class. So we look here, we still have our root here. We have penguin belly, which is set to pink. But in penguin class, we can set that variable again and overwrite it inside of penguin. And also inside of anything inside of penguin, right? So it inherits it for all of the descendants of whatever CSS class or HTML tag we're using. So I'll say penguin belly, and I'll set that to white. And now you can see that it has inherited it there. Let's comment this out one more time. So that changes it again, right? Penguin belly is set up here to pink, so it's going to use that. Or if I comment, or I remove that comment and make it an actual line of code again, then it inherits it properly inside of the penguin class. Run the tests and we get a pass. What do we got? 1 more. Oh, it waves now. That's cool. Use a media query to change a variable. CSS variables can simplify the way that you use media queries. So for instance, when your screen is smaller or larger than your media query breakpoint, you can change the value of a variable and it will apply its style whenever it's used. A lot of terms here that I need to explain. A media query is a way that CSS basically can handle different types of screen sizes, or different, not even screen sizes necessarily, but just generally different situations you can think of it in. Right now, I'm running this on a really big, like 40-inch monitor, right? So this is getting displayed in this huge monitor. There's a lot of screen width, there's a lot of screen height. That's really different than this, right? Than my iPhone. It's much, much different. The width here is very different. Like in pixels, it's, I don't know, 300, 400 pixels maybe. I don't know what the exact number is. Someone in the comments is going to be like, that's wrong, it's blah, blah, blah. I don't know what the exact value is. The height is really different too, actually, right? It's actually quite high. It doesn't have a lot of width, but it has a lot of height. Whereas my monitor here is very wide. It's pretty tall as well, but the larger value here is width. Media queries allow us to target different situations, whether that's width or height, or even things like pixel density and stuff like that. There's a lot of different things you can do here, and it allows us to say specific CSS for specific situations. So in the root selector of the media query, change it so penguin size is redefined and given a value of 200 pixels. Also redefine -- penguin skin and give it a value of black. Then resize the preview to see this change in action. Okay, so we have our media query here, which says for max width of 350 pixels. So this is going to say, apply these CSS, apply everything inside of this media query only when it is a max width of 350 pixels. So anything under 350 pixels, apply the CSS. So in here, I'll say penguin size is 200 pixels and penguin skin is black. Now it says resize the preview to see this change in action. What does that mean? Well, if I come over here, you can actually see I can resize this. And what I'm gonna do is shrink it, and now you can see the penguin gets smaller and the color changes. So this would be, let's see if we can find it. A little bit more, there we go. So right around here, this is around 350 pixels, right? So this is above 350 pixels, all of these get applied. As soon as this goes under 350 pixels, we then replace those variables with these two, penguin size 200, penguin skin is black. Let's run the tests, and I believe we're done. 100% complete. We completed our basic CSS. Alrighty, so that was 44 lessons. That went by really quickly of basic CSS. So we learned things like classes, IDs, media queries, CSS variables. We really covered the basics of CSS. I hope this was useful. Again, I'll mention here at the end that there is a resources page here on my website, which I'll link to in the description, bitesize.xyz/resources. Just sign up for my newsletter. You'll see a link here. If you aren't signed in, you'll get a little prompt to sign up and join. You'll get access to cheat sheets, study guides, practice questions for all of the freeCodeCamp code throughs. So our basic CSS one, this one that we just did. If you want to do some extra homework and make sure you're really getting the stuff that we're learning. Also, our basic HTML, which I recorded a couple days ago. And I imagine as I record more of these, you'll get access to all of them here on our resources, as well as all of the other content that I've worked on for years, really. You can get access to all of that here just by joining our newsletter. I'll also send you a weekly email, which has all kinds of really interesting stuff about new and cool things in the programming world. So now as you're learning stuff like HTML and CSS, you will find a ton of use in things like writing about React or Flutter, or all of these kinds of tools that are out there in the world that allow you to do really cool things. Now that you're starting to kind of wrap your head around the basics of writing code. Make sure to like and subscribe and turn on notifications, and you'll get a notification every time I upload another one of these free CodeCamp code throughs, as well as my weekly videos on just kind of leveling up and growing your software development career. I do all kinds of tutorials and guides and show you what I'm working on and all kinds of cool stuff. And one last thing, if you use this and you found it useful, there's a link to our Discord in the description of the video. come say hi, tell me that you're working on this stuff and what you've learned, and say hi to other people in the Bite Size community as well. It's a really cool growing community that I think you'll get a ton of use out of. So thank you so much. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.